This is not a perfect optic by a long way, despite all its faults. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another one. Well, now, a couple of weeks ago I was looking for some vintage lenses on eBay. I thought it would be good to get a couple of new lenses in, and I found two very interesting ones. One of them is a really good example of why we shoot vintage lenses. It's imperfect, but the imperfections kind of come together to form a whole that somehow works, and that's a perfect example of why we like vintage lenses and why we shoot them, and I'm going to review that lens today. The other lens was a simple tale of eBay seller naughtiness, but more on that soon. Okay, lens number one is this one. It's the Petri 50mm f2. This is on an M42 mount and it came on a Petri SLR camera. It's a very unassuming little thing, but I've heard good things about them, and I've heard that Petri was an independent optical manufacturer. I know they farmed a bit of stuff out towards the end, but I think for the most part, as far as I'm aware, they were an independent optical manufacturer, so I thought it would be an interesting one to go at, a kind of lens that I hadn't used before. Unfortunately, I don't have either the lens or the camera with me anymore. They were sent to me in good faith, I am certain of that, but unfortunately the camera wasn't working when I received it. It must have been damaged in transit, and so the lens and the camera have now gone back. But I'd already shot the lens before trying the camera, so I've got the images. Now, I wasn't sure whether to review this lens or not, because it does seem perhaps a little bit cheeky, but as I didn't set out to pull a fast one, it seemed okay to review it. So let's have a look at what it can do. Well, all right, let's check out the area of sharpness first. Well, it's reasonably good, and it's comparable to other or some other 50mm f2 lenses. It's not quite as sharp, wide open as, for example, a Nikon 50mm f2 or an Olympus 50mm f1.8, or indeed an equivalent lens from any of the major manufacturers. It's not far off in sharpness, but it does have a slight softness just overlaid over the whole image. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a very nice effect, and after all, one of the things that, well, certainly I don't like in certain situations about modern lenses is that they are just too sharp. So a bit of softness can be lovely. It can suit certain shots, it can suit certain moods, it can suit certain circumstances, and this lens does have, certainly wide open, that little bit of softness to just soften the whole image up and make it that little bit nicer. Right, colour, what does it do with colour? Well, actually, it does really nice things with colour, and it gives very delicate, almost pastel-y, almost watercolour at certain times kinds of colours. They're certainly not in your face, they're certainly not oversaturated. They're similar perhaps to the Pentax 135 f3.5. that does very nice pastel-y sorts of things with colours, and in fact they're probably even more similar to the colours that come out of the Industar 61. That's a former Soviet lens, a little LTM, like a thread mount rangefinder lens, and it also gives these beautiful, soft, delicate, pastel-y colours. So these are very similar, very delicate, very restrained, absolutely not in your face, absolutely not oversaturated. Although having said that, this lens does give nicely saturated, quite well saturated colours actually, in certain circumstances and in certain lights. But generally speaking, I found the colours to be rather delicate and very, very nice. Background blur. Well, it can be nice, but it can also be rather nervous. Close to the subject at the minimum focus distance of 60 centimeters, which is a bit long actually for an SLR 50mm lens, but nevertheless that's what this one has. So at the closest distance of 60 centimeters, this lens can give some rather nice soft blur. It's never totally smooth. There are always some artifacts of character, shall we say, little anomalies in the way the lens is designed that give rise to artifacts in the background. Those are always there, but at the closest distance it's fairly smooth. Now if you pull back a bit with objects in the medium distance in the background, that's when it gets a little bit nervous, a little bit jittery, a little bit, oh, I'm scared, I don't know what to do with this blur kind of shot. And that does happen quite a bit. It happens mostly with foliage in the middle background, and that can be a challenge for any lens. Many deal with it much more smoothly than this. This is very, very jittery indeed, very, very nervous indeed. And in fact, it's one of the more nervous lenses that I've seen, certainly with foliage in the middle distance. If you pull back a bit, then it becomes nicer, and it can become quite nice. There are always artifacts in the background, against straight lines or points of light, you know, specular highlights. Those are always there. It's never completely smooth, but it does give relatively smooth blur with character. But those medium distance shots with foliage in the background, oh gosh, those really are quite nervous. However, so it's not the nicest blur in the world, but however, it is nicer than the Nikon 50mm f2, for example, which has really, really badly nervous blur. And in fact, I've not really seen many other lenses with as nervous blur as that, and that's at a wider range of distances also. So it's actually nicer, it's got nicer blur than the Nikon 50, and you know, the blur itself adds up to character. It really lends character to the lens. I hope you can see by now that what's coming together here is not an assemblage of perfect visual elements. It really isn't. It's an assemblage of imperfect elements, and we have yet to see what they add up to. So let's press on and we'll look at contrast. Well, this is a fairly low contrast lens. Now again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I do like the low contrast look. I'm not necessarily a fan of, you know, very bright, very high contrast shots. I think it's fair to say that this is a low contrast lens. That is, it doesn't have a big wide range of shades between the darks and the lights in the shot. That is to some extent dependent on lighting, as it is with any lens. I shot this lens in diffuse lighting. I didn't have any choice because, well, because UK, because cloud. All these shots were made in diffuse light, and it coped pretty well with those conditions. It gave a nice, regular, low contrast look. I didn't get the chance to shoot it in direct sunlight, but if I had, I do think that this lens would probably flare out quite easily. I would guess it would drop its contrast fairly quickly with the sun in the frame, but I haven't shot it in those conditions, so I can't say. What I can say is that in the diffuse lighting conditions I shot it in, it did fairly well, although the images do seem to be rather low contrast images. Chromatic aberration, well, it seemed to do very, very well on that test. There's very little that I could see. That's not to say it isn't there, but when I shot it, I saw very little to speak of. Now, it might be that I didn't find the ideal or, well, unideal conditions for it to emerge, but I did shoot a fair few tree branches against bright sky, and I would have expected it to emerge under those conditions if it was going to do so. As I say, it doesn't mean it isn't there, but certainly when I shot it, I saw very, very little to speak of, and according to these results, it does seem to be very, very well controlled on this lens. Do I like it? Well, I've got to say I've got mixed feelings about this lens. I don't know if you saw last week's episode. If you did, you may have seen me refer to a horrible lens that was coming up and that I was going to review in the very near future. Well, this is it. This is that horrible lens that I spoke of. At that point, when I said that, when I called it horrible, I hadn't shot it very much. I'd gone out and done maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 shots in not terribly good light, and it just didn't seem to me to be making very good results. They were low contrast, they had very poor blur, and it just looked to be a bit of a mushy mess on a very brief initial acquaintance. Then I went out and shot it again, and I looked again, and I have to admit that I actually rather like these images, despite the technical faults of the lens, and it does have quite a few. This is not a perfect optic by a long way, despite all its faults. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that's a rare thing in a lens. Usually you'll get a lens with faults and flaws, and very often those flaws and faults don't come together to give anything nice, but in this lens I'm very glad to say they do. This lens is greater than the sum of its parts, and that is a really neat thing. Would I buy it over, say, a Nikon or an Olympus equivalent? No, I wouldn't. But this lens has a very special feel. It's not a lens I'd want to shoot every day, but it has a very special feel, and it would be a really good lens to shoot if you're shooting, for example, a movie where you want the 60s look, or if you're making stills where you particularly want that kind of 60s look. Why do I say 60s look? Difficult to say, but looking back at some of the old stills my dad shot in the 60s, it kind of has a similar look to those. Looking back at old 60s movies shot on colour film, it has a similar look to many of those. So that's why I say a 60s feel. This is a really good lens for certain situations, for certain images, but personally it's not a lens I would want to shoot every day. It will be very useful for getting that particular look, and it's cheap as well. This lens can be found for around £30 to £60 pretty easily. Don't buy a Petri bayonet mount lens though. This one's an M42 mount lens. I was looking at Petri bayonet lenses before I bought this one, and before I bought, I thought, okay, I'll check whether there's an adapter. I couldn't find a Petri bayonet to Sony E-mount or indeed Fuji X-mount adapter. I just couldn't find one anywhere. So I went with an M42 lens. So I would advise, don't buy a Petri bayonet lens unless you know for sure you can adapt it, because there don't seem to be very many lenses out there. Right. At the top of this episode, I did mention a second lens that I bought from eBay. This is a lens that I've been looking for some time. I've done some research on it. I've had various ones on my watch list for some time. It's a really well-known lens. It's the Nikon 105mm f2.5 lens, sometimes called the Afghan girl lens because it took that fantastic image of a little girl in Afghanistan. She's sitting on a doorstep. I think she's got a blue door behind her from what I can remember. So I really wanted to try this lens. I've never used one before, and as I'd used a couple of 100mm lenses recently, I thought, yeah, this would be a good one to try. So I bought it, I paid for it, but it didn't arrive. So it wasn't looking good. I messaged the seller and I didn't get a reply. I waited a couple of days and I messaged the seller again and again. I didn't get a reply, and it was fairly clear to me now that this lens wasn't going to be sent out and that I'd fallen for a scam. It's not a problem. eBay protects buyers really well, so it's raised with them at the moment, and I don't expect to be out of pocket. But it is a cautionary tale, and it is worth noting. There are naughty people out there, boys and girls. Not everybody is honest, and not everybody plays the game straight. I mean, generally it doesn't need to be a problem if something like this happens. As I say, eBay have very good buyer protection, but it's a faff that we can do without. It's put me behind 2 weeks or 3 or thereabouts in making an episode on this lens, and I really wanted to do that. I will find another one, and the episode is coming soon, I promise, but it has put it back by 2 or 3 weeks, and that's a faff I didn't need, but it is coming, so stay tuned. It will be with us in maybe a couple of weeks. So I guess that is it. Oh, I've got to get this chair fixed. It's going to give way on me one day. I guess that's it from me for now. Many thanks for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you found it useful. I hope it's been to some extent educational and perhaps even entertaining as well. Many thanks to subscribers for your support. That's really appreciated. Many thanks to patrons for your support. That is really appreciated. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not chuck us a sub? That would be appreciated too. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in, watched the show, given thanks, given super thanks, or engaged with the channel in any way. I really appreciate it all. If you'd like to become a patron of this show, if you like what we're doing and you think you'd like to help to support, you can do that over at www.patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do that for $1 or from $1, I should say, per week. But as for me, that is it for now. So if you're not doing anything too troublesome, bothersome or irritating around this time next week, please do tune in for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.